people that said what they wanted to do all the other people. The CCUs want to go out. Jordan has said on another email,
Folks, I think we'll get started.
I'll maybe send a message to remind you of the dates. I think there's a couple who said we can do the October dates.
Folks, I think we'll kick off because we're running a bit behind schedule. So, good afternoon, welcome to the Human Rights Workshop. I hope you're in the right place. If you're not, the door's locked, so enjoy human rights for the afternoon. I hope you had a good lunch. Sometimes energy dips a bit, but I'll try and do enough energy for all of us. Welcome. So we have a bit of a mixed audience, and when I first started thinking about what we would talk about in this workshop, I expected the audience to be predominantly IPM, but now I realise that we have a lot of external partners, we have a lot of prison management colleagues, so what I thought we'd do in the first section is just get us all on the same page about where human rights are involved with HMIPS, how they impact our standards, how they impact our work every day. Then I'll do a bit of recent updates and developments in human rights in Scotland and how that may come to impact the work of HMIPS. And then I'll hopefully cover that relatively quickly. I'll talk quite quickly, get through the material, and then we'll hopefully have a good amount of time, 20 minutes or so, to have the floor open to you folks, and you can tell us about human rights in your work and how that impacts your day-to-day, and we can sort of have that cliched peer learning experience. So, part one, how do human rights impact and how are we grounded in that work at HMIPS? We'll start with our mandate. Our mandate is within the Prison Scotland Act 1989, and that's what gives Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, or His Majesty's Chief Inspector now, I should say, going to get used to that, her authority to enter and inspect prisons. And then with a 2015 Scottish statutory instrument, laid down the legislative foundation for our IPM network. And they are in prisons every week, every prison in Scotland. And that really sets the legislative foundation for our monitoring work. We also have an international mandate through the optional protocol to the UN Convention Against Torture, Inhumane and Degrading Treatment, or OPCAT for short. And that establishes an NPM, which is part of my role, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And it really establishes that preventive mandate in our work. The fact that by the very nature of opening closed institutions up, by the fact that our monitors are in every day, every week to every prison, that in itself should have a preventive mandate. And then our role as an NPM, and HMIPS is one member of the NPM, is to really push that preventive mandate as far as we can. And it also places a duty on us as a scrutiny body to make regular unannounced visits to places of detention. And as you know, from the inspection side of the business, while we maintain our right to make unannounced visits, the majority of our visits are announced, so really it's the IPMs, the monitoring part of our business, that fulfills that mandate for us in terms of unannounced regular visits. And we talk about it as being the breadth and the depth. The inspection team will move into a prison for 2 weeks and do the depth of an inspection, whereas visitors are in there often picking things up, and really valuable intelligence and insight for us. So, the NPM, I just wanted to talk about this briefly, partly because it's half of my job and half of my salary, but also just to show you the broad nature of where our work fits in. So HMIPS, we can see just on the right side, that's our logo, but we're one of 21 members, and it's really to show us that our work is part of something quite big, and it covers every area of detention in the United Kingdom, pretty much, and it covers all of the various devolved areas. And as you know, some of our partners in Scotland attend with us on inspection, so we work with the Care Inspectorate, we work with the Scottish Human Rights Commission, we occasionally work with Mental Welfare Commission for Scotland. We had a colleague from Health Improvement Scotland in this morning's workshop who pointed out the valuable work that they do with us, although they're not a member of the NPM. So this isn't exhaustive of all of our partners by any means, but these are the members of the National Preventive Mechanism that work on that OPCAT mandate that I was discussing earlier. And it's really showing that our work comes into that kind of international framework of NPMs globally. Oops. So as this won't be news to many of you, our standards are broken down into 9 standards along these lines, and really all to say here is that there used to be a 10th standard. We used to have a standard on equality and human rights, and when we reviewed the standards a few years ago now, we thought, well actually, equality and human rights are intrinsic parts of all of these standards, so by removing it and having it as a standard in its own right, it wasn't quite recognising that you need to have equality and human rights in purposeful activity, in decency, in personal safety, in every single area here of our standards. It's really an intrinsic part. So these are when our inspection teams go in, we inspect along these standards, and each of them are broken down into quality indicators. And as the IPMs amongst us know, when the IPMs are in, all of your work is placed onto a system along these standards. And I guess the point of highlighting this is that sitting behind all of these standards are all of these human rights frameworks which have been built into the standards. So when we're going in doing our inspection and monitoring work, we are applying the Mandela Rules, the Bangkok Rules, the Havana Rules, the various international covenants and conventions. So they are built in to every level of our standards. So what I kind of wanted to show by this slide is that our day-to-day work may not reference human rights as much as perhaps I would like it to, but it does have the impact and the authority of the human rights framework behind it when we're going in and doing our work. And part of this workshop and part of my role is to help draw that out and make sure we're all aware of that at every level. So, to talk about the CPT minimum standards, sometimes they're helpful because the CPT take what can feel like quite abstract human rights concepts. Everyone has a right to an adequate standard of living. What does that mean, really, in practical terms? So the CPT have had a stab at defining relative, kind of more concrete things that we mean by that. And so, for example, with living space, they would say 6 meters squared for a single occupancy, 4 meters squared for multiple occupancy. I guess the point of mentioning this is that that feels pretty small to me, and it feels pretty small in a Scottish context. And HMIPS have said that that's at the very limits of what we would accept. And so I always have to get this the right way around. It's really pointing out that human rights is a ceiling, not a floor, not a ceiling. I always get mixed up between the two, but it's a floor, not a ceiling. And so that says the bare minimum of really what would be considered acceptable. But there is much, it can go much further and should go much further. We apply our human rights standards through a panel-based system, and again, most of you will be aware of this. Really what panel allows us to do is kind of apply it in a practical sense through our inspection and monitoring work. And I mean, a lot of these are quite similar. Participation, accountability, empowerment. Basically what we want to see is that power shift between prisoners and staff, and prisoners being able to have meaningful say over their own lives. That's the key to all of this, and being well-informed and in a non-discriminatory way. And non-discrimination, I think, is an interesting one because non-discrimination isn't a passive duty, it's an active duty on organisations. And it's not sufficient to just not discriminate people. It has to be an active, constant monitoring of processes, making sure that the most vulnerable are being brought in and consulted specifically and going along those lines. So it's a real active part of the duties that we expect as an organisation and we hope to see in establishments that we inspect and monitor. The second acronym that we use occasionally is PLAN, and really that draws on the fact that everyone in prison is experiencing a breach of their human rights, because everyone in prison has a right to liberty. Some human rights can be limited in a certain explicit way, and that's to do with proportionality, lawfulness, accountability, necessity, and non-discrimination, and using that least restrictive model. So as long as we're pursuing a legitimate aim, prescribed by law, all of these things. And the last part there on non-discrimination is quite important because it's explaining that gender, sexual orientation, social class, these things should never be taken into account, but we can take into account particular vulnerabilities. So age, physical and mental health, these sorts of factors should be taken into account, and that is not discriminatory to do so. In fact, it's non-discriminatory to do so. So I thought, as I was putting this presentation together, a legitimate question would be, well, why do we care so much about human rights in HMIPS? Because there are lots of scrutiny bodies around the UK, along the world, that don't focus on human rights to such an extent. They focus on leadership, they focus on effectiveness, they focus on enforcement. So I had a think, and we got together with the Chief Inspector and the Deputy Chief, and to kind of answer that question. And I guess the main point is that we're a human rights organisation for moral and pragmatic reasons. I will read this, I don't like to just read off the slide, but I think it gives the kind of framework for why we operate in this way. So it's for moral pragmatic reasons. The framework represents the standard by which we should scrutinise detention bodies. It gives us the tools and language we need to effectively challenge the prison service, the government and other public authorities to make sure that we meet common decency standards. It keeps us accountable. It keeps the prison service accountable for treating those with care and dignity and respect. The government to account to ensure policy, practice and funding of service provision match international obligations. And it keeps us accountable to make sure that we fulfill our own mandate to do all within our own powers to safeguard the treatment and conditions of prisoners. So that's why it's kind of so intrinsic to us. It works. If we use this language, if we use the tools that we have available to us, it's a very effective challenge, and it also keeps us all on the held to account. So I think that preempts a question that is legitimately raised. So I'll move on now to talk briefly about a few developments happening in Scotland on human rights, and then hopefully we'll have a really good conversation between all of us. So I'll start with the Human Rights Bill for Scotland. I'll just pause here for a moment to reflect that I won't be talking about the Human Rights Act at UK level, as we know that that is potentially being repealed, potentially not, maybe on hold, maybe not. So we'll come back and talk to that if and when we get to that bridge, if there's still a bridge there. So I'll talk about the Human Rights Bill for a moment and how this may or may not affect our day-to-day work as an inspection and monitoring body. There's a commitment to introduce a new Human Rights Bill in Scotland for this parliamentary session, and it came about as a result of the First Minister's Advisory Group and the Human Rights and National Task Force for Human Rights. So similar sounding task forces that sort of came out with similar recommendations, which we'll talk about in a moment. And essentially what they will do is they will incorporate these 4 international treaties, plus a right to healthy environment, plus equality of access. And why bother? Why do that? Well, the answer is that by incorporating these international treaties into Scots law, you're giving people the power to claim those rights in a court as part of domestic law. It makes public authorities accountable where legislation or decisions made by public authorities go against these conventions. That is accountable to a court in a judicial system. Now you may say, or as I may say, that the UK has agreed to these conventions for decades, so why does it make a difference? And it really is this kind of wait and see. It should make a difference. Well, I suppose actually it shouldn't make a difference because these are international obligations, it's international law that we're prescribed to deal with. But by giving people the ability to claim these rights in courts as a judicial application is important. And there will be a role for us as a scrutiny body, as we'll come on to discuss. Now, I will run through some of these recommendations. Forgive me if there's anyone from the Bill team in the audience. The recommendations are very vague. But I think it's important just to have them on your radar as we're going through the day and through this consultation period. So this is the sort of things that the Bill team are thinking about in terms of their work with scrutiny bodies. So further consideration, it's all further consideration, again, quite vague, but further consideration on frontline complaint handling and how scrutiny bodies can enhance access to justice. So that's looking at the complaints model. How scrutiny bodies can be supported through adequate provision of resources. We like that one because it sounds like potentially more money, but we'll see. Then recommendation 11 is all about giving the Human Rights Commission more powers and allowing them to take test cases, which other national institutions of human rights can do. So SHRC can't at the moment. And then this one is a really long, again, quite vague one, but it's around there being an effective use of monitoring and reporting mechanisms that allow that focus on human rights, and there's a role for scrutiny bodies. And I guess what all of this means is that, having spoken to the Bill team that are drafting this, that although by incorporating these conventions into domestic law, we're establishing a judicial route to claim these rights, it doesn't always mean that it has to get to a judicial route. So as I've put there, the Bill team envisaged this kind of multi-institutional system where there is oversight and enforcement of public authorities. In this case, in our context, we're talking about predominantly the prison service, and applying these rights. And there will be a consultation in 2023. We will respond to that when we hopefully have a bit more detail. And of course, we'll be consulting our external partners and our IPMs. So I wanted to break down a little bit what that might mean, because it's all a bit vague. So these are a couple of rights that are included in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So things like an adequate food, adequate standard of living, housing, continuous improvement, enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So this applies, I should be clear, this will apply to all of us, everyone. It's not just a detention setting. But this will allow those in detention settings and elsewhere to claim these through the International Covenant. And so what is it? I mean, you could argue that many of these rights already exist, but it's an additional tool to challenge that treatment in custody, which is really important to us. It imposes an additional duty on the state for release, so things like adequate housing and clothing. We know that not everybody released from prison is provided with the right sort of reintroduction framework, and that's an additional duty on the state. And it really helps us focus our monitoring and our human rights on this human rights framework. So moving on briefly, I'll just talk very quickly about some of the in the background work that HMIPS are doing around thematic work. So we currently have quite serious concerns about remand in Scotland. As you will know, Scotland is one of the highest remand countries in, I think, Europe. People are spending seriously prolonged time on remand, way in excess of 140 days in many cases. And there is a difference in regime available for remand and convicted prisoners. Although the prison service are doing their best in those conditions, it's the percentages of remand population is far too high, and so we're looking at what we can do in terms of the levers we can pull to influence that. Transport, there will be a review into transport, and that, again, that's part of our legislation. Progression is an interesting one. As you know, we've had a progression review going on for some time. Hopefully that's nearing its completion, and that's about how a prisoner from closed condition can progress through their sentence to what we call the national top end, less restrictive approach to open conditions in Castle Huntly. And that is a key, the fact that that route is available is a key human rights principle, because it says that, if we go back to Plan, it says that the least restrictive model should be used where you can demonstrate less risk. So that progression model is great. Doesn't seem like everyone is able to get through their sentence, get to programs, get there. It's one of the number one complaints that comes up for monitors in prison and for inspectors. So that will hopefully come out with some recommendations relatively shortly. And we also have a review coming to a close now on separation and reintegration units, and hopefully we'll have some interim findings from that shortly. So I just wanted to spend a few moments on some additional resources. I am one. Those of you that don't know me, you can email me if you have human rights-based detention, HMIPS, or indeed NPM concerns. But I wanted to point you in the direction of the APT Detention Focus Database, those of you that aren't already aware of it. So I'll just pull it up now. So this database is really good because it takes everything I've just been talking about and it breaks it down into what the standard calls for. So for example, if you were interested in what the human rights framework says on religion in prison, you could just click religion. It would tell you all of these various rights, and then at the very bottom, it will give you the legal standards for that. So it's a pretty good resource, and I just wanted to draw your attention to it as my attention was drawn to it. It covers lots of various complaints, files and records, means of restraint, searching, health, all of these different areas. So it's a useful resource to look at what the human rights standard is. And I guess the only proviso I would say on that, I think it's really very good, but the only proviso I would say is sometimes, occasionally, maybe more often than not, the Scottish prison rules sometimes go further than what the Human Rights Framework says. So I would say always cross-reference between the two. But I just wanted to highlight that. So the next part 3, is really open to you. I thought instead of a kind of traditional Q&A, it would be really interesting just to kind of open the floor and to listen to any remarks that you have. Tell us about human rights in your line of work, monitors, prison management staff, external partners. Kind of tell us about your areas, and hopefully we can all learn something. So I would like to know, just to guide the conversation, I'd like to know about kind of key issues and good practice that you see in your work, but really anything you want to tell us. It's over to you. Anyone?
Not normally a quiet bunch.
Vicky, I think you had a point you wanted to raise. India, go ahead, tell us.
Yeah, my day job is I work at the Scottish Children's Reporter Administration. So obviously a lot of the children that we see have parents who are in prison. So I guess we've talked a lot about human rights in terms of prisoners' rights.
Yes.
But I find the link between wider rights of children and families who've got a family member in prison, siblings as well. It's in a much wider context, and I'm just not sure how we marry those things up.
And do you think there's enough joined up thinking between those?
No.
Yeah.
Public sector, isn't it? But,
Yeah.
no, I think, you know, I was in the Iceland workshop earlier on, and you know, they were talking about the culture and you know how they in Iceland and Norway they don't tend to have young people in prison or insecure like we do over here, and it just got me to thinking that the cultural issues that we've got over here in terms of human rights is just I don't see how we're going to be able to achieve that if we continue to think in the way that we do.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm not breaking any confidences by saying that we wrote to the Cabinet Secretary around getting children out of custody last year, I believe. And part of our argument when we wrote to the Cabinet Secretary was it's in contradiction to the CRC, you can't be locking children up. And they don't recognise that. They say it's a clear priority to remove children from custody, absolutely. But they don't recognise that it's a breach of human rights to have children in custody, which is an interesting view. Anyone else have anything they'd like to add? Yes, hello.
I'm a prison monitor in Barlinnie, and there's been a number of issues recently that have led me to be aware of equality and diversity rights. I suppose I've never been surprised at the unmet need in Barlinnie. The needs are huge, and you know that there's not going to be resources to meet the need. But more recently, I've had so many examples where prisoners are feeling frustrated because they know that they've got a need, that it's possible for the prison to meet, and they're not doing it. I think of one guy who is traumatised from his time in military service, PTSD, he was getting lots of help in combat stress before he was put in prison. They won't move him from the noisy side of his hall to the quiet side of his hall because he doesn't deserve it, because he doesn't cooperate enough. I mean, this is what takes you from the needs agenda to the rights agenda.
Yeah.
That you've got prisoners starting to say, but you know, they're denying me access to the thing that would actually mean that I get a decent treatment here. And I feel we're at a very early stage of talking about the sort of equalities legislation that's out there. The prisoners, and I was at a meeting recently with a young prisoner and his mum. I mean, he's grown up in the education system, so she's brought him up in an educational system very aware of his needs around his autism. And she's expecting the prison system to be aware in the same way. It's just not.
It's tricky. I think what you were saying before, it's really interesting because there are certain things when we go in and inspect a prison in terms of kind of participation and involving prisoners in their own lives, or, you know, around PIAC models, prisoner representation in committees and things like that. There's some models. Some prisons do it better than others, absolutely. I mean, recently were in a prison that did it really well. The institution there was great. There were prisoners there. Some of the prisoners chaired the meetings. There were prisoner representatives on all the committees. It felt like, from our perspective, that they had a really good dynamic of participation. And you speak to the prisoners and they say, well, no, there's no representation. It's just lip service. And it's really difficult for us, as monitors, as inspectors, to come to a conclusion on that, because actually the framework is really good. They're doing the right thing. The prison is doing the right things, but prisoners don't feel that they are. And so it can be quite tricky. And the point you make about getting through that, it becomes a rights issue, is spot on, I think. Yes?
I think there's a wee bit of nuance there as well, though. So I'm the head of Offender Outcomes at HM Prison Edinburgh, and I've been a quality diversity manager for about 8 years. So 10% of my prisoners identifies disabled when they first come into reception, which is where we collect that data.
Yeah.
But I think the real data on that should be something like 70%. So a lot of these people were trying to participate, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment, legality. Yeah. But if those people are not empowered from the outset to have those conversations, to recognise that being illiterate is a disability, to recognise their own needs, then it can be very difficult for us to get that information out. So an IPM, a resident might go straight to IPM and say, these are my needs, but they might take 6 months, 8 months before those relationships with staff are embellished enough to go and have that honest conversation. We've got screening tools in NHS, but even within the 9 protected characteristics, we've got very different types of people. So we've got some trans people that get their support and they're very happy in custody, but then we've got other trans people that are very disordered with personality disorders that create lots of problems, and then on top of that and sorry, it sounds so stereotypically prison cliche here, but we do have some residents that will utilise equality and diversity policies to circumvent processes or to try and fight the system in some kind of way, and we've got to be really mindful of that as well. So I totally appreciate that there's always more to do. I've got 866 individuals that are all individuals that all have some protected characteristics and need support, but to be able to break down those barriers and have those honest conversations is always going to be a challenge to me, in my opinion.
Can I maybe just come back? I think you've said something very important there about the prisoner's responsibility as well. This week I met a prisoner who is fed up with the autism support group, he tells me, because they want to be victims all the time. And I think there is a bit about how the prisoner works in partnership with the authority that we have to hold on to, isn't there? It's not that they're not in a care establishment. It's about what they do for themselves and how we understand what they can do themselves, how they're held to account for that, but equally how we're held to account.
My next natural question for this is, we had 1,860 drug deaths in 2020 and like 19 less than next year. So when it comes to equality, diversity and human rights, at what point are we going to start having conversations about addictions recovery being a health improvement issue as opposed to a disciplinary criminal issue, and at what point will our rights systems recognise that?
Absolutely.
And poverty.
Yeah, you're just spot on, and I think it is a rights issue. It is a rights issue, and that's part of the consideration. I think what we're seeing is human rights getting involved in building into some of these policies and some of these. So when we look at drugs deaths in prison, I think they do need to have a human rights foundation, absolutely. But I agree with you, so it's clearly a rights issue.
And I think the women's estates may be moving in that direction with the new women in custody strategy and everything. But in the back of my head, I'm always thinking, what about men? Because actually, what's it Harry Burns says, hurt people, and the majority of men in prison are in prison because they've been through significant trauma as well. Very few of them are bad, just like very few of the women are bad, but I mean, you hear them talk and they think we will eventually maybe think about widening it out. Actually, we should be doing that as a priority if we truly want to address the issues.
Totally agree. What I would say is that trauma-informed practice for staff and prisoners is definitely the future.
Yeah.
And we are upskilling and upscaling that approach, but if I was a prisoner and I wanted to be particularly challenging, I would say that I'm being discriminated on the basis of my gender because the staff that work with me haven't had that additional level of trauma-informed practice and training. So I totally agree. I think there's a lot to be discussed there.
Yeah. And like particularly Pullman as well. I mean, if you're thinking of scaling up, Pullman's your first port of call, I would say. I mean, it's the environment in comparison to what new HMP Stirling's would be like is very, very different.
Yes. Yeah. Anyone else like to add something?
I think then you see a lot of really good practice and whenever they've looked at treatment of older prisoners, it's always been really positive. But perhaps that move towards rights-based and having some kind of charter and minimum standard would help, because that's something that a prisoner who's maybe moved from one prison where it's done well to one where it's done less well has something to say, I need this. And I think kind of relying on good practice, I think I would probably prefer to see that more as a centralised function at HQ, so there is, this is what we expect from all our prisons. So if you've got older prisoners and this is their basic needs, and rather than just relying on people being decent, vast majority will be, but
anyone else have anything they'd like to add or comment on or ask? Nope. Okay, so that's pretty much all I wanted to cover, really. I thought I'd give you a bit of an overview of our work and how human rights sits in there. If you have ideas, we're always sort of trying to come up with ways to talk about human rights, extra bits of training that those of you that are IPMs amongst us would value. Do come and talk to me. Happy to listen. I think that's pretty much everything, unless anyone else has anything they'd like to mention. That's it. Thanks. Yes?
Do you have any relationship with mechanisms for prevention of torture in other countries, like to exchange knowledge or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So through the National Preventive Mechanism network, we're in touch with NPMs across Europe at the moment. I was in Warsaw last month with a lot of them, and it was really useful to kind of exchange that kind of practices and how they work. Our model of NPM is slightly different in terms of, for a lot of those models in Europe, their one body is responsible for a lot of the monitoring of all areas of detention, whereas we're made up by lots of bodies. So it's slightly more complicated, but yeah, we're connected with lots of the European NPMs, and it's really useful to kind of share that view.
I'm Brazilian, and in Brazil we have human rights violations in a more, I don't know how to say this, but in a more severe manner, like actual physical abuse from staff spitting on people's food and on everyone's food before lunch, to breaking someone's teeth out, and so I understand that the challenges and the work here is much different, but from what I've seen, I think that a country like Brazil could benefit from some of the institutional and the structure we have, like training for inspectorates and things like that. Maybe it could be a good idea to expand that relationships outside of Europe.
Absolutely, yeah. We're always looking for those sorts of connections, so we'd be happy to. Absolutely.
Did you visit a prison in Warsaw?
No.
You didn't see.
I saw the inside of a Novotel.
Similar.
I suppose the question would be how, when you attend events like Warsaw, how does that help you kind of approach your work in HMIPS from a human rights perspective, in terms of taking that learning? So a bit was about sharing, but how do we share that wider?
It's interesting. I think one of the takeaways I took from attending Warsaw was, I guess, as monitors and as inspectors, we're all looking for the unknown unknowns. That we have to be conscious of what do we not know that we're not seeing when we're in these places of detention. And I think part of the practices that they do in Latvia actually was really interesting. So they go and they interview prisoners that have been released from prison months, years afterwards, and ask them about their experience. And we don't do that. And I think that was an interesting practice. And there's lots of places are starting that journey of oversight and monitoring and inspection, and lots of places are a bit further along than us. So that sort of sharing of views was really useful. In terms of how that impacts HMIPS, Vicky, we will be doing a briefing on kind of the best practice and shared concerns. Interestingly, one of the biggest shared concerns that across a lot of the NPMs in Europe were around transport, as one of those closed areas that haven't yet been opened up for us. Monitors are in prisons every week, whereas we don't flag down transport vans, GeoAmey vans, and we don't go into the vans.
We do. The IMB.
You do at the IMB?
Oh yeah. Escorts, courts and escorts, and the inspectorate does as well.
Right.
Yeah, we do
We
it
have
across
to-
the piece from the beginning when you're put in a court cell all the way through to getting into prison. And it's quite important because it does define what happens.
I think it's an important area for us to look at. It's a gap at the moment. It's in our legislation. We have the power to. We don't do it at the moment.
I think the other thing, I think you made a really important point in terms of human rights abuses, is talking to people afterwards. Because the more abusive a place is, the more scared the prisoners are about talking to you while they're there, because they don't trust there won't be repercussions. And we find that particularly in immigration detention, where people are terrified that if they say the wrong thing, they'll be deported, which is what they don't want to do. And certainly before we've had something about interviewing people after. And when I was doing police custody, the same thing, interviewing people once they've left police custody.
to try and, so they can say things they might not dare to say when they're there.
Yes. I think it was a really important point for me. And when we recently inspected Castle Huntley, which is the open conditions prison, and there's a similar feeling there. Their level of complaints are way below average, and there is what feels like a myth that if you complain, you'll be sent back to closed conditions. But we inspected it, we looked at it. There's no evidence that people that complain get sent back to closed conditions in any real corroborative way. But that still exists, so that still means people aren't complaining. So there isn't sufficient, in our view, I'm preempting the report that's going to come out, but there isn't sufficient reassurance to prisoners that they can complain without being sent to closed conditions. I mean, we're reassured that people aren't sent back to closed conditions for complaining, but we're not reassured that there's enough being done to reassure people that that's the case. But yeah, absolutely, I agree with you. Yes?